This happened when I was still in secondary school. A friend of mine, Rachel, and I drove out to a public reservoir outside of Minnesota. There had been thunderstorms rolling through the region all evening, and we were parked near a designated recreational area, watching lightning hit across the water. We weren't doing anything unusual, just sort of sitting in the car, talking, windows down, you know. But around 10 p.m., a county ranger came through and told us that the area was being closed off. We left without argument, obviously. Neither of us felt like going straight home, though, so I drove us to another pull-off, and I'd been there before with some friends. It wasn't marked as a park, just a gravel area near a bluff overlooking the same body of water. No lighting, no facilities. I'd never had any issue there. As soon as I shut off the engine, Rachel received a call from her boyfriend. He was agitated and said that he had a strong sense that something was wrong, and wanted to confirm where she was and that she was okay. It was a bit weird, but at the time I dismissed it as just controlling behavior. She ended the call quickly. We got out of the car and walked about 10 meters toward the edge of the overlook, sitting on the flat rock. The storm was still pretty distant. There wasn't much wind. The lake below was calm enough that we could hear small waves hitting the shore. After several minutes, though, I noticed a sound that didn't fit with the rest of the environment. At first, it registered as wind moving through trees farther down the shoreline. Then it became more rhythmic. We stopped talking without sort of acknowledging it directly. It was crying. Not intermittent, but continuous, and a single voice. Given the location, my first assumption was that somebody else was nearby, maybe another group, or maybe somebody dealing with something personal. It was a pretty large area after all, and sound traveled pretty unpredictably across water and rock like this. For a short time, the explanation held. But then, the volume increased. The sound wasn't echoing randomly anymore, and it was closing distance. The cadence changed from quiet sobbing to something strained and uncontrolled, like somebody struggling to breathe between cries. There was no shouting for help, no words, just what I would describe as vocal distress. Rachel shifted closer to me without speaking. We both stayed seated longer than we probably should have, but neither of us wanted to be the first to say what we were thinking. As the sound continued to approach, additional noise layered in, vegetation being pushed aside, uneven footfalls on rock and dirt. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be moving along the shoreline, not toward the road. At that point, I tried to rationalize it as someone intoxicated or emotionally unstable walking through an unsafe area. That explanation, though, really didn't make me feel much better. The sound, it was now close enough that we could tell that it was coming from a single person, likely a woman, moving upright. The crying suddenly escalated sharply, as if the person had suddenly become aware of something. I finally said, as evenly as I could, that we should probably leave. I didn't raise my voice, but immediately after I spoke, the crying spiked into something louder and way more erratic. Branches broke nearby suddenly too, and the movement shifted direction, straight toward us. There was no verbal exchange, no call-out, just rapid movement closing the distance. We stood and ran, and I don't remember deciding to do it, but we just sort of did. The car, thankfully, was close, but the ground was uneven and loose, and I dropped my keys once, and had to grab them again while running. The sound followed, faster now, not speaking and still crying. We got into the car without fully shutting the doors before I started driving. I didn't check the mirrors, and I didn't look back. I drove until the paved road ended, and then just kept going, until we finally reached a populated area. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We just sort of sat there, dumbfounded as to what we had just experienced. Later, we tried to break down what could have explained something like that. Someone in crisis? Someone under the influence? Someone intentionally trying to scare us away? But none of those explanations really accounted for what we experienced. We never went back there at night, and I personally avoided the area entirely unless it was daytime and busy. What bothers me most isn't that I don't know what it is. It's more that if we had stayed silent and just a few seconds longer, I really don't know whether it would have approached anyway or how close it already was when we finally reacted. And so if we had stayed any longer, would we even be here to tell this? That uncertainty, it sits in my stomach like a rock. I was staying overnight at my grandmother Elena's house after a severe storm moved through the area one night. The rain was steady, the power failed at around 9 p.m. and mobile coverage dropped in and out. There was nothing unusual about the situation, but the conditions limited distraction for sure. We were sitting in the kitchen with battery lamps, waiting for the electricity to return. Elena began talking about local customs that she grew up with. She was careful to describe them as rules people followed, not as supernatural facts. And what stood out was that each belief was paired with a behavior that discouraged exposure, isolation, or risk. One example concerned hair. She said that women were expected to keep their hair tied after dark, especially when leaving the house. When I asked why, she said that loose hair was considered a signal that drew unwanted attention. She didn't elaborate any further, but framed it as a method of avoiding notice rather than anything mystical. She then described an incident involving her cousin, Anna, in the early 1970s. Anna was a teenager tasked with collecting water from a hand pump located, just outside of the residential area of where she lived. This was before indoor plumbing was even common, and according to Elena, Anna went early in the morning before daylight to avoid queues. On the walk back, Anna became aware of multiple men walking parallel to her path, one on each side, several meters away. They didn't speak or approach her directly. When she reached a roadside shrine near a crossroad, the men stopped. One of them told her that she was fortunate that she was carrying water, implying that it marked her as having a purpose. After that, though, they just left. Elena emphasized that Anna never saw their faces clearly and didn't run. She continued walking at the same pace until she reached the main road. Another belief involved transporting food at night. Elena said that people avoided carrying prepared meals or sweets through wooded or unlit areas. She described this to a practical reason as well. Food invites interaction. She referenced a man returning from a wedding reception decades ago who was approached by a woman on a rural road asking for food. He reportedly placed a portion on the ground without engaging and continued walking. The next morning, though, the food was still there, which was obviously a bit odd, and also suggests that maybe there was ulterior motives. Elena said that it reinforced the advice not to stop or converse when isolated. She also mentioned household practices, like a metal object under the bed was common in older homes, especially in rooms used by children. She said that it was believed to ground anxious thoughts. When I told her that once I found a kitchen knife under my mattress as a kid, placed there by my mother, she said that that was pretty standard in their family. No explanation beyond that. Now, the final account she shared involved avoiding conversation at night with unfamiliar people, particularly near abandoned structures or open land. She cited a story about a man encountering others carrying a coffin on a dirt road and asking who died. The reply he received was "you." Apparently, the man who saw these people carrying the coffin said that their faces all of a sudden started to transform into these ugly-looking creatures. He described them as monsters, and apparently he ran after this and they chased him, but fortunately they didn't catch the guy. Elena took this as a warning tale meant to discourage curiosity and engagement, rather than a literal event, but still, apparently others swore up and down that it was a real event, and that the man refused to go back there afterwards. Now, I don't treat these accounts as evidence of anything beyond what they really are, but still, I found it difficult to ignore how many of the rules aligned with modern safety advice, despite being explained through older language. What was pretty unsettling, though, was that last story, which is why I decided to tell all of this. Obviously, there's a little bit of folklore sort of mixed into all of this, but still, that last one, it's kind of creepy, right? I should probably add too that Elena, she says that she actually spoke to the guy at one point, and allegedly, he swore up and down that what he saw was real, and allegedly took that stance to his grave. This is something that actually occurred to me, and it changed how I interpret certain events, even though I still consider myself somewhat of a skeptic. So in 2024, my family took a trip to South Korea. We spent time in Seoul, Busan, and then a few days in Jeonju. The trip was normal as well until one night, after dinner and a late visit to a small live music venue, we left the venue at around 11:15 p.m. The streets were quiet and the area was mostly empty because it was late. We were walking back toward our guest house along a narrow sidewalk that ran beside a canal. The path was lit by streetlights, but the light was uneven and the shadows were pretty strong. I would say about 100 meters ahead, there was another person on the sidewalk. It was a woman pulling a small suitcase, and she looked older, and her clothing appeared outdated. Plain layers, a long skirt, and a wide-brimmed hat. But what caught my attention was her posture. Her head was sort of angled straight down as if she was looking at the ground the entire time. She was walking slowly, and the suitcase made a distinct scraping sound against the concrete. My sister and I noticed her at the same time. We didn't speak about it out loud, but we both felt sort of unsettled by her. We kept our pace steady and passed her without making eye contact. But once we were past her, the sound of the suitcase scraping against the ground continued for a moment before fading. We then got into a taxi to return to the guest house, and during the ride I looked out the window to check if the woman was still on the sidewalk, but instead, I saw her standing among a group of people near a bus stop. She was in the middle of the crowd, and nobody appeared to notice her presence. Also, her posture had changed completely. Her head was tilted back and her face was visible now. And all I can say is that it looked unnaturally pale and rigid, like the skin had lost all of its tone. Her expression was blank and her eyes seemed open but sort of unseeing, if that makes sense. The crowd around her kept moving as if she wasn't even there. There was no reaction from anyone, in fact. And that's what made this whole thing worse. If she had been a normal person, someone would have looked at her or at least reacted at her posture, but nobody did. I didn't mention it to my family at the time because it felt like a detail that would sound irrational if I said it out loud, but that image, it always stayed with me. The next day, I went through the photos from that night to see if I had accidentally captured her at any point. There was no sign of her in any of the pictures, unfortunately. And look, I still don't believe in ghosts in a literal sense. I think that there's an explanation for strange sightings, and I generally dismiss paranormal claims. But this incident is one of the few things that I just cannot rationally explain away. It was too specific, too consistent, and too clearly observed to be a simple misperception. Even now when I think back about it, I still feel the same discomfort that I felt that night. I don't know what it was, but I know that it was real enough to affect me, and it's something that I just cannot shake. So, I just want to be upfront here and say that the only reason why I'm sharing this is because I want to see if anyone has a rational explanation for this. So my family does not buy into paranormal claims, like, at all. We believe that there's some form of afterlife for sure, but we always look for logical reasons behind strange sounds or movements. In fact, we have a bit of a bad habit of sort of obsessing over the obvious causes first. Anyway, a week ago, something happened that none of us could really explain. It was late afternoon, around 5:30, and my mum and I were alone at our home in rural Texas. We were in the living room with our German Shepherd, while our cat was in the hallway. The house is a fenced property with a tall gate at the driveway entrance, and when the gate opens, the sound carries through the yard and into the house. Out of nowhere, there was a loud knock at the front door. 3 knocks, very sharp and heavy. We both sort of froze because the sound didn't match the usual pattern of someone entering the property. I mean, the gate was still closed, and there was no engine noise or movement outside that would indicate that someone had come in. Well, we got up to go and check. The dog reacted immediately, very weirdly. Ears down, tail tucked, body tense. This was not normal at all. Even when strangers come by, she usually barks and runs to the door. But this time she backed away, then ran upstairs and hid under my mum's bed, shaking. We went outside and checked the yard, though, and there was no one there. We even checked for footprints, but no disturbed gravel, no signs that anyone had even been at the door. The gate remained shut too, which was really weird. The property is fully enclosed, mind you, and the nearest neighbor is elderly and physically limited. And really, there's just no way that anyone could knock and leave without us seeing or at least hearing them move through the gate. We both heard the knocks too, and we both confirmed it. We didn't imagine it at all. Our dog even heard it. But there was no evidence of a person outside. Well, after that night, I stopped closing my bedroom door, and when it is shut, I hear faint knocking from the other side, and when the door is open, there's nothing. The knocking only ever happens when the door is closed, which is very strange, but the animals have been acting differently as well lately. The cat and the dog hide behind the furniture, growling or hissing at empty spaces, when they're normally calm and friendly. The change in their behavior as well is really significant. The whole family has also reported hearing voices that are not there. My dad said that he heard my mum call him from the kitchen while he was in the shower one day, even though my mother and I were outside. When I'm home alone, I sometimes hear my parents calling my name, but there's never anyone in the house. Honestly, I thought that I might be losing my mind at one point. But then, the knocking happened again today. It was late, around 9:45, and I had just come home from work. 3 hard knocks at the front door, loud enough to make the key ring rattle. At this point, I'm not sure if this is psychological or something else. If it is a person, then what they're doing without entering the property is kind of amazing, to be honest, without leaving evidence and without any logical motive. If it's not a person, then, well, I don't know what to make of this. Like I said, I'm sharing this because, well, I need an explanation or at least some advice. So if anyone has experienced something similar or has a practical way to check what is happening, I would genuinely appreciate it. I don't want to jump to paranormal conclusions, but I also really don't know what else to do at this point. I'm 24 now, and I've lived in the same house since I was 11. My parents and I moved in with my grandparents at that time, and for several years my aunt and cousin also lived with us, and now it's just me, my parents, and my brother. The house is large, old, and has a lot of dark corners. I've always been sensitive to negative energy as well, and as a teenager I often felt like the house had a very heavy atmosphere. I avoided walking around at night unless I absolutely had to, and when I did have to leave my room, usually to get water from the kitchen, I saw a figure on multiple occasions. It was tall, dark, and human-shaped. I could tell that it was a man in old clothing, a long coat, a hat, and a rigid posture. He stood in the living room, motionless, and never moved toward me. I assumed it was my imagination, and so, in the end, I just sort of ignored it. One night, though, I was ironing clothes in the storage room that we used as a laundry and ironing space. I was watching videos on an old computer, and after finishing, I shut the computer off and the screen went black. That's when I saw my reflection, and also the man was standing directly behind me in the reflection. This was the first time that I'd ever seen him so close. I felt immediate panic and left the room quickly, and after that, I avoided being alone in that space. There was another incident too later where I experienced sleep paralysis and I saw him standing at the foot of my bed. I don't remember the details, but I do remember my dad saying that I came into their room crying and told them about it. That's the only reason that I really know that it happened. I told my grandmother about the figure at some point as well, and she said that it was her father watching over the house. I didn't question it then, but it didn't feel like a protective presence, at all. Anyway, years passed and eventually I stopped seeing him. I stopped thinking about it as well, until a few months ago when my cousin, my brother, and I were having dinner and sort of reminiscing about our childhood. When out of nowhere, my cousin asked if we had ever seen a man in a hat in the house as teenagers. My reaction was immediate and intense. I asked if he was serious, and my cousin confirmed it, and my brother, who is usually the most rational person that I know, looked visibly unsettled because he realized that he wasn't the only one who had seen the figure. They described seeing the same man in the same way, tall, dark, wearing a hat and a long coat, always standing still. The fact that two other people saw him independently made it impossible to dismiss as just my imagination any longer. We discussed it and realized the sighting stopped after our grandmother died, and we couldn't explain why. When I brought it up to my father, he said something that changed the context. He told me that my grandmother had been involved in an occult group and performed private rituals in a small room in the house that we were never allowed to enter alone. He believes that she must have summoned something and it left once she died. Obviously, I don't know if the explanation is accurate, but it certainly does fit the timeline. The sighting started when she was active in the house and ended after she was gone. Today, the house feels pretty different. The heaviness is certainly gone, and we still experience odd events occasionally, but they're way less intense. For example, we sometimes hear or see children moving around the dining room, and they appear to be harmless, and I also feel my grandfather's presence more often. I don't feel threatened by anything, and my mother recently saw a man that she identified as my grandfather in the kitchen, and that felt reassuring, I guess. The only remaining concern is the possibility that the entity was not simply a watcher, but something that was connected to the rituals. I don't know if it's gone or just dormant, and I don't know whether the house is safe or not. I would like to know what steps to take to verify what's happening and how to protect the household, so if you have any thoughts or any suggestions, then I would love to hear them. This story comes from my grandmother and has been repeated in my family for decades now. She was in her early 30s and living in a small rural community in northern Romania. She had 2 young children at the time, and one late afternoon in late autumn of 1969, she was returning from the fields with a horse-drawn cart. The children were pretty tired, so she chose a shortcut that ran along the edge of the village cemetery. The shortcut was known locally as the Old Lane, and people generally avoided it after dark. It was already dusk when they approached the cemetery boundary. The horse was normal and calm, but it suddenly stopped and refused to move. My grandmother tried to pull the reins, and she shouted and urged the horse to move forward, but the animal didn't respond. It was also sweating heavily, and its breathing was shallow and quick, as if it was resisting something. The horse's legs were planted, and it just wouldn't budge, either forward or backward. My grandmother began to pray aloud using phrases that she knew by heart. She didn't stop to analyze the situation, and she simply continued until the horse reacted. After a minute or two, the horse abruptly pulled forward and broke into a run. The cart moved at a pace far beyond normal, as if the horse was trying to escape from something directly behind them. The children, they started crying, and one of them, the younger child, began pointing over her shoulder and screaming. My grandmother turned around and saw a figure standing near the cemetery fence. He described it as short and bald with an unusual face and that she couldn't recognize it as human. She didn't see clear features, only a distorted shape that looked wrong and really huge dark black eyes. The figure didn't move forward, but it also didn't retreat. The cart didn't stop until they reached their home, and once inside, my grandmother immediately shut and locked the door. She did not speak about the event in a sensational way at any point, and she treated it as a fact and avoided that path after dark from then on. The account has remained consistent within our family, and no one has been able to provide a logical explanation for what she saw. The main elements that stand out are obviously the horse freezing in place, the sudden burst of speed, and the figure that appeared without moving or showing clear human features. I can assure you as well that the story has been passed down for years and no one has added any details or changed the timeline whatsoever. And so, it remains the same today as it was told decades ago. This occurred in New Mexico in 2014, along a canyon trail. My friend and I were in our early 20s and had planned a weekend of drinking and some camping. We had a basic campsite set up in a designated area near a river. We were loud, careless, and not thinking about the rules or the environment. A couple of other campers, they warned us about leaving our trash or damaging trees because the area was considered sensitive by the local communities there, and we ignored the advice, and at one point, my friend started striking a small juniper with a hatchet for no reason, cutting into the bark until a chunk came off. Well, later that night after we were drunk and trying to sleep, that's when the incident began. At first, it was a feeling of pressure outside the tent, like somebody was standing close to us. Then we noticed movement along the tent wall. It looked like shadows, but the light in the campsite wasn't strong enough to cast them. The air outside felt colder and denser all of a sudden. The shapes were small, maybe around 2 to 3 feet tall, and they moved in a pattern around the tent. They also didn't walk normally. They moved in a sort of synchronized fashion, a bobbing motion, as if their bodies were dipping and rising with each step. Their silhouettes appeared as if covered in thick, rough material, like unkempt hair or maybe fur or something. They formed a tight circle and kept moving in a loop. The sound of their movement was heavy and deliberate. We could hear something like a chant, low and repetitive, but we couldn't make out any of the words. Then the contact started. The tent fabric was pushed hard enough that it dented inward and hit my friend's head. It wasn't a light touch either. It felt like something solid pressing in. When we unzipped the tent to confront them, there was now nothing there. The surrounding campsite was empty, and the only thing that moved was the wind in the trees. But each time we zipped the tent back up, the shapes returned, continuing their circle. The movement resumed and the chanting started again. It repeated this pattern for at least 30 minutes as well. One of the figures seemed to carry a long stick or something. The silhouette also suggested a necklace or a collar made of something irregular, possibly bone or stone or something, I would guess. And the overall impression that I got was of an intentional ritual rather than random movement. We didn't see anything aggressive beyond the poking, but the fact that the tent was being physically pressed, and the pattern kept repeating with no visible source when we opened the tent, made it feel like we were hallucinating or something. In the morning, after no sleep whatsoever, we packed up and we left immediately. We didn't speak much during the drive home, and we never did return to that area after that. Now, I've read about little people in various Native American traditions, including some that describe guardians of canyon areas, but I don't know if that's what we actually saw or if that fits these stories or whatever, but I only know that we were both awake, both saw the same thing, and we both experienced the same physical interaction. Personally, I'm still trying to understand what any of this was. And every time that I think about it, I get this unsettling feeling in my stomach. I enrolled in this institute in late August of 2021, shortly after turning 19. It was a regional technical college located outside of a mid-sized town. I chose it deliberately because it was far enough from my family home to feel separate, but close enough that I could return within like half a day if something ever went wrong. The surrounding area was mostly agricultural land, dairy farms, storage sheds, and long roads without foot traffic. The campus itself was small and internally focused, with most student life contained in one residential complex and a handful of shared facilities. The residence hall that I was assigned to housed students from the creative and performance programs. The building had 4 levels, separated by program and gender, with a shared laundry and storage area below ground level. It was the type of place where everyone sort of became passingly familiar with each other within a few weeks, even if you never really spoke. You learned routines quickly, who practiced late, who smoked outside after midnight, who always studied in the common room, things like this. Within the first month, I became aware of 2 male students who were often together. They were brothers, close in age, and both enrolled in media studies. They were not particularly noticeable at first, but what made them stand out over time was not their behavior towards me, but the way that other students spoke about one of them when he wasn't present. His name was Lucas. I heard about Lucas indirectly through classmates in my course. One evening, while working on a group assignment, someone mentioned that several students had already filed complaints about him. Later, a student that I shared a kitchen with explained that a group of women from the drama program had collectively submitted written statements to the administration. The statements described repeated unsolicited messages, unexpected appearances at rehearsals and off-campus events, and a pattern of, persistent contact that continued after requests to stop. According to her, the administration acknowledged receipt of the document and then did nothing observable. At the time, this information felt pretty distant to me. Lucas had never spoken to me directly, and I didn't receive messages from him ever. I had never even noticed him watching me at all. Given that, I sort of categorized him as a known risk to others, but not an immediate concern for myself. That judgment, though, would later feel very careless, though not obviously wrong at that time. Now, one contextual detail matters here a lot. Many students at the institute, they were international and private transportation was pretty uncommon. Public transit in the area was limited too, and the rides were typically coordinated in advance. Lucas and his brother, they didn't own a vehicle, and this was confirmed due to a mandatory residence meeting at the beginning of term, where students introduced themselves and discussed shared resources. I remember this because several people joked about how isolated the campus was without a car. At the end of term, I returned to my family home for the summer break, and I stayed there for several weeks. During this time, the campus and everyone associated with it sort of faded from relevance. I resumed old routines, and I reconnected with some friends that I hadn't seen regularly since enrolling. One evening in early January of 2022, I met a childhood friend for dinner at some point. We chose a small restaurant in town that locals favored largely because there were few alternatives, and it wasn't really a place that people passed through casually. You either lived nearby or had reason to be there. We had both been seated there for about 15 minutes when I noticed someone across the room who did not fit into the usual local pattern here. It took longer than it should have to register why he seemed out of place, but when I realized who it was, the recognition came with a delay rather than a shock. Lucas was sitting alone at a table near the wall. He was facing in my direction, and I cannot say with certainty how long he had been looking at me for, but when our eyes met, he certainly didn't look away. I informed my friend quietly, and she looked over and confirmed that she recognized him from a photo that I had previously shown her. At the time, neither of us reacted outwardly. There was no interaction, in fact. He didn't approach, he didn't signal or gesture. The lack of action is what made it difficult to interpret in the moment, really. It was only after we left that the logistical implications became pretty apparent. The town that I was in was not a direct transit line from campus. Reaching it without a car required multiple connections and advanced planning. Lucas had no social ties in the area as far as I knew. His brother was not with him too, and there were larger towns significantly closer to the campus where students typically traveled during the breaks, that is. In other words, there was no obvious reason for him to be where he was at that time, unless it was intentional. I didn't report the encounter. I couldn't articulate a violation that had occurred. Nothing he did crossed a clear boundary in that moment. But still, the event disrupted my assumptions about distance and anonymity for sure. I had believed that leaving campus meant leaving its risks behind, but that belief was no longer tenable. When the new term began, I learned that Lucas and his brother were no longer enrolled as well. No announcement was made, no explanation was offered. Students speculated quietly, but nothing was really ever confirmed. I never saw either of them again, in fact. I completed my program in mid-2024, and eventually I left the area entirely. And it was soon after I left that I eventually found out what happened there. So apparently Lucas and his brother, they had sexually assaulted one of the girls there. And according to what I heard, they also tried to kill her, but she narrowly escaped, and apparently now they're in prison. Which sort of begs the question, right? Why was Lucas in my town, watching me from that table, where really he shouldn't have been there? In early November of 2023, I traveled to Denver, Colorado with my partner to mark my 26th birthday. The trip was intentionally low effort. We avoided nightlife, limited alcohol, and planned to return within 48 hours. The only part of the trip that went poorly was the return itself. On the morning of our flight home, I felt pretty unwell. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to be disruptive, and after arriving at the airport, I became nauseated and had to step into a restroom before security. I took an over-the-counter motion sickness pill that I had packed, and I had used the same medication before without issue, but it reliably caused drowsiness. By the time that we reached our gate, the medication had taken effect, and I sat in one of the standard terminal chairs, upright but leaning forward with my arms wrapped around my backpack. My partner was seated slightly behind and to my right. The gate area was moderately crowded, with people moving continuously through the seating rows. I sort of drifted in and out of light sleep, and I was aware of the surrounding noises, but not actively tracking it. At one point, I registered my partner laughing under their breath, and I assumed it was related to something on their phone, or maybe a passing interaction nearby, and didn't react. When I woke more fully several minutes later, the nausea had subsided a bit, and as we waited to board, I asked what had prompted the laughter earlier. The response was delayed, which, in retrospect, should have been notable, but my partner explained that while I was asleep, a woman had stopped directly in front of me. According to them, she appeared to be in her late 60s or early 70s. She was not carrying luggage, food, or a phone. She didn't appear confused or lost. She simply stopped walking. The woman leaned forward slightly and looked at my face. She didn't touch me. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge my partner, despite them being clearly visible. The staring continued long enough that it drew attention from another passenger seated nearby, a woman approximately our age, who made eye contact with my partner in apparent confusion. My partner said the woman's expression didn't change. There was no sign of distress, recognition, or curiosity, just sort of sustained attention. After several seconds, she briefly glanced at my partner, returned to gaze at me, and then walked away without explanation. I asked how long the interaction lasted, and my partner estimated between 10 and 15 seconds. Certainly long enough to feel inappropriate, but not long enough to justify intervention without escalating the situation further. At the time, I dismissed it as a sort of benign oddity. Airports create unusual conditions, right? People misidentify strangers. Fatigue and age-related issues exist, and none of those explanations are implausible on their own. What bothered me later, though, was the specificity of the interaction. The woman didn't scan the area. She didn't even hesitate. She stopped directly in front of me, oriented herself deliberately, and maintained focus despite social cues that would normally interrupt such behavior. She also chose not to engage verbally, which would have immediately clarified her intent. Obviously, I never saw her again, and she didn't approach anyone else. In fact, there was no follow-up interaction. Nothing really happened after that, and our flight boarded normally. We returned home, and life continued without incident. But still, the encounter altered how I felt about public spaces for good. I had been asleep and visibly impaired and unaware of my surroundings, and the fact that someone noticed and acted on that awareness, even briefly, was pretty difficult to ignore. The other thing that I should probably mention here is that my partner said that, as they were watching this woman, they took notice of the fact that they seemed to have something in their hand. Now, they refused to speculate at first because they didn't want to freak me out or anything, but they did say eventually that what they thought that they saw was like maybe a sharp pen or something to that effect. I have since been more careful about sleeping in public spaces, not because I believe that that specific woman posed real danger, but because the situation demonstrated just how easily attention can be directed at someone who is temporarily unable to respond. That realization, it hasn't resolved into fear, but it also hasn't faded either, and it has made me much, much more cautious. Before I share this, I just want to say that this situation, it didn't begin with anything that seemed risky. I think that's the part of what made it so difficult to respond to once it did escalate. There was just no single moment where it clearly crossed a line. Instead, it unfolded in sort of fragments that only formed a pattern much later. So in mid-2022, I managed a public-facing account on a social platform focused on short written reflections. The account was intentionally impersonal, and I never showed my face, disclosed my location, or discussed my private life at all. The audience was pretty broad, and engagement was usually limited to brief comments or just some questions. I treated it as a sort of one-way channel rather than a social space. Around that time, though, a man reached out through direct messages. He appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s based on what he shared. The exchange was brief and superficial, but within a few days his messages began to feel intrusive in tone and assumption. I ended the conversation clearly and without ambiguity, stating that I was not interested in further contact. I blocked him immediately afterward. That should have been the end of it as well, but it wasn't. Within weeks, anonymous messages began arriving through third-party tools that allow unverified submissions. At first, the content was vague, critical but non-specific. Over time, though, the messages became hostile. Some included insults directed at me and my family. Others implied inevitability or future confrontation without stating anything explicit. Several messages were framed in sort of religious language, accusing me of deception or moral corruption. I didn't respond to any of them. Shortly after that, new accounts began appearing as well. They followed my page, viewed content, and then disappeared. The accounts had no history, no personal identifiers, and no consistent naming pattern. Some used religious terminology, and one used a variation of my own name in another language. Blocking them had no effect, though. New accounts would appear within days. During this period, I started receiving security alerts from my email and social platforms as well, indicating login attempts. Password reset requests appeared that I had not initiated, and at the same time the anonymous messages shifted in tone, referencing personal details that I had never shared publicly. Some claims were demonstrably false, such as assertions that the sender had spoken to members of my family or community leaders about me. The intent appeared to be intimidation rather than accuracy, but the behavior expanded outward from there. Friends of mine began receiving unsolicited messages from unfamiliar accounts. The messages alternated between insults and attempts to discredit me, sometimes framed as concern from a neutral observer. The writer style was consistent across accounts. The timing aligned with periods when I would block or report activity on my own page. And for several months, this remained confined to online spaces. But then it changed. In early 2023, I encountered the same man in person at a location that I attended regularly. It was not a place connected to my online activity, and the first time I assumed that it was coincidence. The second time, his attention was unmistakable. He watched me continuously without approaching. I left early and went to a nearby cafe to put some distance between us. He entered shortly afterward and sat where he could see me clearly. I noticed him holding his phone in my direction, and later that evening, images taken from that location were sent to me through an anonymous account. When I didn't respond, a short message followed expressing hostility. That was the moment when the separation between online harassment and physical presence disappeared. I contacted the local authorities that same day. They documented the incident and ensured that I would leave safely. The man, he didn't remain in the area after that. However, without definitive identification or direct threats, the scope of the intervention was pretty limited. Afterward, the activity receded, but it never did stop. There were periods of silence followed by renewed waves of anonymous messages and new accounts. The content shifted repeatedly as well. Religious condemnation, character attacks, claims of social consequences. At one point, messages referenced the city where I was born and linked to an old, inactive account that I had not accessed in years. I compiled evidence and submitted it repeatedly. Platforms removed accounts but could not prevent replacements. Authorities eventually informed me that without clearer attribution, the case really couldn't proceed any further. At present, thankfully, there has been a stretch of relative quiet. Based on past experience, I don't interpret this as resolution by any means, but there was never a confrontation, explanation, or demand that could be negotiated or even refused. The entire situation stemmed from really what was a single brief rejection and continued without input from me. What remains unsettling, though, is not the content of any one message, but the persistence across time and methods. This guy has chosen to maintain attention long after contact was severed, and they've adapted their approach when barriers were introduced. Like I said, there's no clear conclusion at this point, only an ongoing awareness that disengagement, it hasn't ended this other person's involvement. And really, at this point, I don't know what to do. This happened about a year ago in a ground-level unit on a residential complex. The building was arranged horizontally rather than vertically, if that makes sense, with a single corridor of apartments that shared exterior access. Several of the units are short-term rentals, while others are permanent residents. My partner and I, we lived at the far end of the building. There was no unit directly beside ours on one side, and the nearest neighbor apartment is above us. We had returned the previous evening from a week-long trip as well. The apartment was not settled back into order at that stage, and an open suitcase was still on the bedroom floor. Clothing and shoes were spread across the room, and the items that we had brought back were left out on visible surfaces. But what I'm getting at is that the space didn't resemble a vacant or temporary rental by any means. It was clearly occupied. Now, at about 8:40 in the morning, I became aware of the bedroom door opening. The sound itself was minimal, but enough to break my sleep, and when I opened my eyes, the door was no longer fully closed. It was open just enough to create a narrow gap, and from that gap, I saw part of a face, specifically one eye, looking directly into the room. The halfway light had been switched on, which is why the figure was visible, and I didn't hear footsteps or breathing. I couldn't determine the person's gender or age or anything. I didn't move. At first, I assumed I was misinterpreting what I was seeing due to fatigue. The night before had been exhausting, and I had slept very poorly. I continued looking at the doorway, expecting the figure to resolve into something explainable, but it never did. The person remained still for a period that I later estimated to be between 15 and 20 seconds. Eventually, the eye withdrew. The door was pulled closed from the outside. There was no sound indicating urgency or surprise. The movement was controlled and deliberate. Only after the door closed did I return to check whether my partner had gotten up. They were still in bed beside me asleep. At that point, I noticed that the bedroom light had not been turned on, confirming that the hallway light had been activated intentionally by whoever entered. I was unclothed at the time, and that realization came after the immediate confusion subsided. The physical vulnerability of the situation was more disturbing than the intrusion itself, really. There had been no attempt to hide the act of looking, is what I'm getting at. The person had not retreated quickly, as someone might if they had entered by mistake. Once fully awake, we checked the apartment. Nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed beyond what had already been unpacked. The front door was unlocked, and I had not secured it the night before, a decision influenced by exhaustion and familiarity with the building. Later that morning, I contacted the property management office. I asked whether anyone had accessed our unit and whether security footage could be reviewed. I was told that the hallway cameras were not operational any longer, and I was also informed that no maintenance workers were scheduled for that day in any unit. The manager said that she would check whether nearby short-term rentals were occupied, but could not provide immediate answers. No follow-up explanation was offered, and no record of entry was ever found. Without footage, there was no way to determine whether the person was a guest from another unit, a staff member acting without authorization, or someone who really should not have been in the building at all. What remains unsettling the most, though, is not the possibility of a mistake, but the behavior itself. If the person believed that they had entered the wrong apartment, like I said, there would have been multiple cues that should have prompted immediate withdrawal. Instead, they chose to observe and then leave quietly without acknowledgement. I have since taken additional precautions. The door is locked consistently from now on. We requested written clarification from management regarding access protocols, though no substantive changes have been communicated. There have been no repeat incidences, which I'm thankful for, but really that means that there's no conclusion here. I really hate the thought of somebody coming in and peering at me while I'm completely butt naked, but still, I'm just glad that it didn't turn into something more than that. And honestly, that's probably because my partner was by my side. I was 11 years old when this happened, and my parents had already been separated for several years at this stage, and my sibling and I, we were staying at my father's rental unit as a part of our scheduled custody arrangement. The apartment was in a complex on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, an area with a bit of a reputation for frequent police activity at the time and high tenant turnover as well. The unit itself, it was pretty small and minimally furnished. There were 2 bedrooms, each with an attached bathroom, and also a living area that opened onto a narrow patio through a sliding glass door. The apartment was on the ground floor, with direct access to a shared outdoor space bordered by trees and overgrowth. When we stayed there, my younger brother and I shared one bedroom. Now, sometime after midnight, we were woken by repeated impacts against the front door. The force was enough to carry through the apartment, and my father got out of bed immediately and moved toward the entryway. He didn't open the door. Instead, he checked the peephole and then spoke through the closed door. The man outside was asking for someone who didn't live there. According to what my father said later, the name that he used belonged to a former tenant. My father told him plainly that he had the wrong address and that children were inside. The response was more shouting and continued pounding. At that point, my brother and I were fully awake. My father came into our room and instructed us to follow him without explanation. He moved us into his bedroom and then into the connected bathroom. He locked both doors, and I remember him taking a golf club from the closet before closing himself into the bedroom side of the space. From the bathroom, we could still hear the noise. The man had moved from the front door to the back of the apartment now, which meant that he had successfully broken open the door. The sound shifted from solid impacts against wood to sharper blows against glass now. My father called the cops and the apartment management at the same time. My brother was crying uncontrollably, and I was quiet, not because I was calm, but because I was trying to understand what was going on. We heard the glass door break. The sound was unmistakable. There were no footsteps inside the apartment afterward, which was really confusing to me at the time. We remained in the bathroom until the police arrived, and when the officers entered, they announced themselves repeatedly before my father unlocked the doors. It was close to 3 a.m. by then, and my mother had already been contacted and arrived shortly afterward to take us home. The man who had broken in was gone. The living room floor and the patio were streaked with blood everywhere, though. That is an image that I will never forget. Later, we were told that the man had forced his way through the sliding door, and he had cut his wrist really badly, apparently, enough to cause significant bleeding. Instead of entering further, he fled toward the wooded area behind the complex. Police tracked him by following the blood trail and found him a short distance away. He was taken into custody and he was treated by paramedics. We were never told what charges were filed or what ultimately happened to this guy, too. In the years since then, the event has sort of settled in my mind, less vivid than it was at the time, but certainly more persistent. I replay the scene often in my head. It's the escalation and the containment and the waiting that always makes my skin crawl. I'm also sensitive to sounds at night now and to doors that feel insufficiently secure. I also sometimes continue to experience nightmares involving that forced entry night, regardless of where I'm living. These symptoms overlap with broader anxiety issues that I have, for which I am now receiving treatment for. But what makes the incident difficult to contextualize is just how narrowly it avoided becoming something way worse. The man was not targeting us specifically. He was not acting with a clear plan, in fact. The violence was really chaotic and sort of misdirected. And that randomness is part of what really makes me feel uncomfortable about the whole thing. Years later, too, long after my father had moved away, the same apartment complex made local news for a series of break-ins involving a man entering occupied units at night and climbing into bed with residents, apparently. The incidents continued for months before an arrest was made, and that despite surveillance footage. I don't connect these events directly, but still, the knowledge that such behavior could occur repeatedly in the same environment reinforces a basic conclusion that I reached pretty early on in my childhood even. Safety in familiar places often depends on conditions outside of one's control. And that understanding, it has never fully faded for me. The decision that set this into motion was practical, not impulsive. Severe weather had slowed everything down for days, and I needed to make sure that my car was usable before an interview scheduled for the next morning. I treated it as a task to complete, and certainly not an outing. A multi-day snowstorm had left most residential streets partially cleared and parking lots unevenly plowed. I spent several hours clearing snow and ice from around my car, started it, and let it idle when I finished getting ready. Once it was running reliably, I decided to take care of an errand that I would otherwise have to do the next day. The store that I drove to was roughly 20 miles away, a large pharmacy just off a state highway. The trip took about 40 minutes due to road conditions. When I arrived, I noticed an older woman standing near the entrance, positioned just outside of the automatic doors. She wasn't holding bags or a phone. She was facing outward, not toward the store interior. As I approached on foot, she watched me without speaking. I didn't stop, and I entered and completed my purchases and exited less than 10 minutes later. When I came back outside, she was no longer at the entrance, and I assumed that she must have gone inside or maybe left. I unlocked my car, sat down and closed the door, and almost immediately there was a knock on the driver's side window. The woman was standing close enough that I had to lean back to see her face clearly. The timing suggested, too, that she had been waiting nearby rather than passing through. I lowered the window completely, which I would not do again in a similar situation. She asked where the nearest grocery store was. I pointed behind her to a small market in the same plaza. She shook her head and said that she meant the other one. I named another store across the road, and again she said no. When I mentioned the larger supermarket chain in the area, she confirmed that that was the one that she meant, and asked if I could take her there. She said that she had been trying to call her daughter without success, and that the store that she named was not nearby. It would have required getting back on the highway and driving several more miles. I asked how she had arrived at the pharmacy, and she said that she had walked. I asked from where, and she named a residential area that would have required a long walk in freezing conditions, across roads without sidewalks too. The explanation really didn't seem to add up with the weather, her age, or her apparent physical condition, so I suggested calling a rideshare or maybe a taxi. She rejected both options, saying that they were unreliable and slow. She repeated that the store was just down the road and asked again for a ride. Her tone shifted, though, from neutral to insistent. She did not raise her voice, but she did not acknowledge my refusal as final either. Throughout this exchange, she didn't look around or attempt to engage anybody else. Several people passed within a short distance, in fact, and she remained completely focused on me and my vehicle. I told her in the end that I couldn't help her and that I needed to leave. She continued speaking for several seconds after that, repeating her request and offering additional explanations that didn't seem to clarify anything, and eventually she stepped back from the car. Now, as I began to pull out, I saw her move toward the edge of the lot. She didn't approach another person, but in my side mirror, I noticed her stop and reach into the front of her coat, partially opening it. She removed an object briefly, long enough to adjust it, and then concealed it again, and it appeared to be a small knife, held low and close to her body. There was no brandishing or overt threat by any means, but that action seemed deliberate and not performative. I drove away immediately. As I exited the lot, I checked the mirrors and saw her standing still, facing the direction that my car had gone. Nothing followed, and thankfully I wasn't contacted again. I have been thinking about this over the past few days as well, and I can list some alternative explanations for her behavior, including confusion or unrelated intent, I guess, but none of those explanations account for the sequence as a whole. The waiting, the insistence on entering my car, the refusal of safer alternatives, and the concealed object revealed only after I declined. I'm 30 years old, and I'm frequently mistaken for being younger. That fact matters too, because it likely influenced how I was perceived in that interaction. Thankfully, the incident ended without escalation, which I was very thankful for. And also, I have been past that pharmacy a few times, and thankfully I have not seen her again. And I really hope that it stays that way. By my third year of university, I had developed a routine that left little room for novelty. Classes, practice, and part-time work filled most of my time, and the campus itself, well, it felt pretty predictable. That familiarity is what made the incident stand out later too, I guess. It occurred in a place that I thought that I understood. This took place in October of 2010 while I was enrolled at a public college in eastern Kentucky. The campus itself sits on uneven terrain with older academic buildings clustered at the higher elevations. I grew up less than 2 hours away and visited home regularly, so the school never really felt remote or isolating. A student organization had arranged an after-hours historical walk through one of the oldest buildings on the campus at some point. The event was marked as an investigation, but in practice, it was a supervised nighttime walkthrough emphasizing the building's age and history. Several of us from the athletics program, we decided to attend together. For accountability, participants were told to move in pairs. Now, the building that we entered was a former administrative hall near the top of the campus. It had thick interior doors, narrow stairwells, and minimal exterior light. To create a controlled environment, interior lights were turned off and most doors were closed. The intention was to reduce background noise and distraction, not to create fear, but the result certainly was an unfamiliar layout in near total darkness. My partner and I, we stayed close behind the rest of the group as we moved toward the upper floor. We were careful to remain physically connected because visibility was pretty limited, and at some point during the transition between the stairwells and the hallways, the distance between us and the others really increased. What I mean is that there was no clear moment where the separation really occurred, only the realization that we could no longer hear the rest of the group. We stopped though when we heard voices further down the hall, assuming that we had taken a wrong turn. Rather than calling out, we decided to retrace our steps quietly to avoid disrupting the event. At the end of the corridor was a heavy wooden door with a narrow glass panel. It was already partially open, and as we approached, the door moved abruptly. It swung shut with enough force to echo down the hallway and continued to vibrate in its frame. The sound was sharp and really unexpected. I mean, who would do that? Given the building's age, the lack of interior lighting, and the absence of visible airflow, the movement felt weirdly unaccounted for in that moment. Of course, unless somebody, slammed it, which would be really weird. We sort of froze at this moment. I didn't interpret the event as intentional or directed, but the timing was difficult to ignore. After 7 seconds, the movement stopped. I tested the handle and the door opened without any resistance. We passed through and found the rest of our group nearby. No one else reported hearing the door, which was really weird. They had assumed that we were still behind them. The discrepancy added to the confusion, obviously, but the group continued without further incident. Later that night, though, while walking downhill toward another part of campus, I lost my footing at some stage. There was no obstacle that I could immediately identify, no visible branch or uneven pavement or anything, but the ground was sloped and poorly lit, so I'm pretty sure that was it. In any case, I sort of fell forward and felt immediate pain in my right ankle. I had injured the same ankle years earlier, and the sensation was familiar to me. I could no longer put weight on it. One teammate assisted me while the others walked ahead to get some help, and I was eventually taken back to my residence hall. Medical imaging the next day confirmed that I had a fracture consistent with re-injury rather than a new trauma. Now, in the years since then, I have reconsidered the sequence of events with more distance, and the building's door was old and heavy, likely affected by pressure differences caused by multiple doors opening and closing elsewhere. The fall, well, that occurred on uneven terrain in low visibility after several hours of physical activity, so yeah, that's not really that weird. But the part that still really gets me is how hard that door was slammed, and also the fact that really nobody else was there. It was just me and my partner. And so, who slammed the door? And how did they slam it so hard that it literally was vibrating within the frame? I still cannot understand that or even come up with an explanation. In fact, we went back there at some point when really nobody else was around, and we slammed the door as hard as we could, trying to emulate what had happened that night. And no matter how hard we slammed that door, we could not get it to do what it had done that night. Whoever or whatever had slammed that door must have done so with so much force that I don't know how that is even humanly possible. I took a job in late 1991, not long after moving. I was 21 at the time and needed some steady work more than anything else. The position was clerical, attached to a large retail building, one of those sort of 19th century department stores that had been renovated in sections but never fully modernized. The facade was preserved heritage stone, the interior a mix of new wiring and very old structural choices that really no one had quite resolved. I rented a small unit though, close enough to walk if I had to. My shifts were mostly daytime, but every so often management asked staff to stay back after closing to process inventory and pricing updates. The work itself was pretty routine, but what stood out almost immediately was where our office was actually placed. The pricing office was not on the main retail floors. It was a converted service room behind the sales levels, accessible by a narrow internal walkway that crossed an open void above the loading area. The room itself barely fit 2 desks, 2 terminals, and a set of industrial label printers, and above us were 2 unused floors that had once been administrative offices, then later storage, and eventually nothing at all. Those levels were officially closed off, though the doors were never locked. In any case, I shared the space with a woman named Karen, a few years older than me, who had worked there long enough to treat the building as an inconvenience rather than a curiosity. During my first week, I noticed small irregularities, sounds mostly, footsteps overheard during times when the upper levels were empty, or should have been at least, the noise of chairs scraping, faint and distant, though there were no chairs left upstairs as far as I knew. Once or twice, the scent of tobacco drifted through the office, despite a strict no-smoking policy, and also some modern ventilation, which should have made that impossible. And so, at first, I just assumed that the building simply carried sound poorly. I mean, old structures often do, right? Karen heard the same things as well, but dismissed them as the place settling, even though it was the middle of summer and nothing was changing structurally. The first visual incident, though, that happened midweek. So I was standing at the printers when I noticed someone at the far end of the corridor outside of our office. The person appeared to be male, wearing dark work clothes, standing still. I turned fully to look, expecting to see a contractor or maintenance worker or something. But when I did, the corridor was now empty. There was nowhere, though, for someone to step into unnoticed. The hallway terminated at a locked fire door. I checked anyway, but there was no one there. Similar sightings followed over the next few weeks, too, always peripheral and always brief. I stopped reacting to them outwardly, but began keeping mental track of when and where they occurred. Unfortunately, though, no clear pattern emerged. The escalation, though, came during an overtime shift in early December. The store was closed and the weather was poor, and only a handful of staff remained in the building. Karen had already left, and I was alone in the pricing office, aware of the rain hitting the upper windows and very little else. After about an hour, I heard movement above me that was more sustained than before, and louder than usual. Not footsteps, but something closer to general activity, I guess, like drawers opening or papers being moved. I decided, against my better judgment, to go and check whether someone had accessed the restricted floors. I took a torch from the supply cabinet and used the old service stairs at the back. The stairwell lights didn't activate, and on the first unusual level, the offices were exactly as expected. Striped rooms, dust and disconnected wiring everywhere. As I moved further along, though, I felt an abrupt sense of, what I can only describe as pressure. It left the clear impression that I was somewhere that I shouldn't have been as well. It was similar to walking into a meeting that you weren't invited into, is how I like to describe it, multiplied and really sustained. I backed out of the room, and that's when I noticed a light ahead of me, actual light, not from my torch, but coming from the direction of what had once been a staff function hall. The doors were partially open, and inside, though, the room was empty. No people, no music, just a single maintenance lamp that apparently had been left on, illuminating nothing in particular. It was at that point, too, that the discomfort escalated into something harder to rationalize. The feeling wasn't dramatic, but it was definitely there, and I left immediately. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I encountered my supervisor, Helen, moving quickly toward the exit. She looked unsettled and asked where I had been. When I told her, she paused and said nothing further until we were outside of the building. We decided to go and get a coffee, and we spoke at a cafe nearby, and she told me that while finishing paperwork, she heard typing and conversation echoing throughout the corridors, distinct enough to recognize speech patterns but not words. She also described seeing a woman pass her office door dressed in outdated business attire. Helen had assumed that it was me until she came out and checked and found my office empty. Neither of us said anything about this incident. I mean, there really was no protocol for that kind of thing back then anyway, and no clear benefit in raising it. I continued working there for another 8 months. The disturbances never escalated beyond that night, but they also never really fully stopped either. The sounds continued. The brief sightings continued. No explanation was offered, formal or informal. Years later, though, I learned that several employees had died on that site over the building's long operational history, mostly industrial accidents from earlier decades. And that information certainly changed the way that I looked at the building. I really don't know what to make of all of this. I did leave the job eventually, and the building is still there, still operating, still largely unchanged above the floors that customers never see. And when I pass it from time to time, I often wonder if whatever was happening in there is still going on. I didn't grow up thinking that there was anything unusual about my mother. For most of my childhood and early adulthood, she was simply the parent who noticed details early and spoke bluntly about outcomes that other people preferred to avoid. It's only in hindsight, after a series of specific incidents, that her behaviors began to register as something that I could not easily categorize. This account refers to events spanning roughly from 2014 to 2023, primarily in the outskirts of Leeds, England, where my family lived, after emigrating from the Midlands. My mother, Mary Ann, worked intermittently in clerical and care roles. She was not religious in a conventional sense, and she didn't affiliate with any organized belief system. She described herself as practical, though her habits suggested something more rigid than intuition and also a little bit less flexible than superstition, I guess you could say. She had a pattern of making statements about future events in a sort of factual tone, without emphasis. These were never framed as predictions. They just were sort of delivered the way that one might state the weather forecast. Minimal detail, no emotional loading, no follow-up, just that. Over time, though, a number of those statements coincided with real outcomes. When my father died unexpectedly from an undiagnosed aneurysm in 2016, I recalled a comment that she had made weeks earlier about needing to sort paperwork sooner than planned. When pressed later, she denied that it meant anything specific. There were other instances too. She anticipated her own legal trouble related to an employment dispute months before it occurred, instructing us to keep documents organized. She also gave oddly precise guidance to my siblings about relocations and job losses that later materialized, though never in a way that could be easily documented or challenged. Physically, there was nothing remarkable about her. She appeared younger than her age, I guess, but that runs in the families. One detail that did stand out, though, was the absence of any clear fingerprints. This became apparent during a passport renewal in 2018, when the scanner repeatedly failed. She explained casually that she had worked with industrial solvents in her 20s and that the skin just never really fully recovered. This explanation was plausible and not verifiable either way, but what unsettled me more than any individual incident was her consistency. She didn't hedge, revise, or dramatize anything. And when she was wrong, which must have happened, she didn't acknowledge it and no one around her seemed to notice. Although, thinking back on it, I really cannot recall a moment when she was wrong. Anyway, the shift occurred after I moved back into her house, temporarily in early 2022, following a relationship breakdown. Living in close proximity again made patterns harder to ignore. She maintained rigid routines and reacted poorly when they were disrupted. She kept handwritten notes about neighbors, schedules, utility outages, and local emergency sirens. When asked why, she said that it was awful to know what normal looks like. Around this time, I experienced two incidents, though, that I cannot fully contextualize. So the first occurred late one night while I was staying over at my sister's house in Bradford, helping care for her newborn. I woke abruptly and told my sister, without prompting, that she should call one of her friends. I didn't give a reason, and I just went back to sleep, apparently. The following morning, we learned that the friend's father had apparently died overnight. The timing aligned, and the information didn't. I dismissed it as coincidence and stress. The second incident, though, was harder to disregard. In October of the same year, I was outside my flat after midnight, on the phone, when I experienced a sudden sort of physiological response, elevated heart rate, auditory narrowing, heightened attention, and mind you, there was no visible stimulus. There was no argument, no noise, no approaching threat, and I ended the call and just went inside. The next afternoon, emergency services were at the end of the street. A neighbor had been found deceased in his home. The cause was later reported as natural, but I did not feel that I had known anything, but what troubled me was the alignment of bodily responses that I had and obviously what had happened. In fact, I later found out that the timing matched perfectly. Well, I raised these incidents with my mother several days later, and she listened intently without interruption. When I finished, she told me not to talk about it further, especially not out loud. She didn't explain why. She didn't express concern, and she simply advised restraint, as if discussing it might introduce variables that she preferred to control. Since then, I've noticed that she withholds information selectively. She redirects conversations when they approach certain topics, she discourages documentation, and she insists that attention itself can distort outcomes. There's no evidence that she possesses any sort of abnormal ability, but there's also no clean explanation for the accumulation of correlations that she's had over all this time. Nothing conclusive has happened since then. I feel completely normal, and I guess that, more than anything else, this is what keeps the situation in my head. I really don't know what to make of any of this, and so if you guys have any idea as to what I should do or how I should approach this, I would appreciate it. Thanks. I live in Iowa, and I also live in a ground floor apartment in a complex built around a shared pedestrian corridor, with exterior stairwells, mail units, and parking bays. The layout matters because sightlines are pretty predictable here. Nothing about the environment is confusing or obstructed. Now, the temperature that night, it was below freezing with steady rain. That combination is uncommon locally and tends to shut things down here. Roads were empty, foot traffic was effectively zero, and I was inside my unit, not tired and not intoxicated or anything, and not even distracted. I'd been awake for several hours and was mentally alert. Because snow had been mentioned in the forecast, I checked outside intermittently. This involves standing a few feet back from the window and pulling the blind aside briefly. I did this multiple times too without any incident. At about 1 a.m, during one of those checks, I observed movement near the mail area, roughly 20 meters from my window. A person was moving quickly up the short staircase leading to the boxes. The movement was normal enough at first, someone hurrying out of the rain. When my attention shifted fully to that area, the person stopped abruptly on the stairs and rotated their head toward my window, The movement was immediate and precise, not gradual. There was no searching motion. It was a direct alignment. I registered a brief visual detail during that motion. Hair, copper or orange in color, of medium length. That's the only physical feature that I could state with confidence, but after that my visual processing failed in a way that I've never experienced before or since then. I could not resolve a face, clothing, posture, or even a clear outline. The figure remained present in my field of view, that much I'm sure of, occupying space on the stairs, but without any definable features. Mind you, this is not darkness related. The area was illuminated, and surrounding objects, the steps, handrails, wet concrete, mailbox cluster, they were all clearly visible and sharply defined. The figure didn't move during this interval, and I didn't feel frozen or anything, but I also didn't attempt to move. The duration was pretty short. I would say maybe 5 to 10 seconds. There was no sense of panic. The dominant sensation really was just sort of discomfort, mainly because of what I was seeing and because, well, I just couldn't make sense of it. I eventually broke eye contact by stepping away from the window, and I went into the kitchen, and I told somebody else in the apartment that I had seen something outside that didn't sit right. I didn't describe the figure in detail because, at that point, well, really I couldn't. I didn't look back outside that night, and over the following hours I mentally reviewed the scene repeatedly. The distance was reasonable, the angle was direct, the lighting conditions should have allowed for identification. The behavior itself raised questions. There was no apparent reason for someone to be running toward the mailboxes in freezing rain after midnight, nor for them to stop mid-motion and look directly at a residential window without hesitation. There's no additional detail that I've delayed mentioning because of its uncertainty or anything here too. During the initial moment, I may have registered a lower limb positioned in a way that really didn't match a natural stance. I really cannot confirm this though. My confidence level is really at about 50%, and it may have been a reconstruction error rather than my own perception. What concerns me most, though, is not the possibility that I just misidentified something. It's that my sensory processing appeared really impaired at that moment. I could see everything except the subject itself, and that selective failure just doesn't align with stress response, lighting issues, or fatigue or anything. I really don't know what to think of it. The incident was brief, contained, and isolated, and that should make it easy to dismiss, I know that, but instead, the lack of a clear failure point, no obvious reason why my perception broke down like this, has made it really difficult for me. That's really the only reason why I'm sharing this now, because, well, I'd rather forget it because it spooked the heck out of me. I, a 29-year-old female, used to do some street performing when I was low on money, and at the time of this story, I was 25. I had recently lost a lot of weight and needed to save some money for skin removal surgery. This was due in addition to buying all new clothing and seeing a chiropractor because of the changes in my gait affecting my spine. Pro tip, by the way, is that losing weight is really expensive. I don't know why nobody warned you about that, but yeah, that was my experience anyway. So, this was a Friday night and I was in a college town near the state university with a lot of bars and restaurants around. Because all of my clothes hung off of my body like a tablecloth, I was wearing a decorative scarf tied into a dress, and it was a little on the revealing side, but it certainly didn't look as sloppy as the rest of my clothing. If you don't wear decent clothing and makeup and such when you street perform, people assume that you're homeless and can be really terrible towards you. This is relevant to this story. So, I was tuning up my guitar, sitting in a camping chair outside of a couple of bars, and at around 8:30 p.m. this beige SUV pulls up and parks in front of me. The guy driving it hopped out and approached me. "Hey, do you want something to eat?" "Oh, no thanks, I'm okay, but thank you." "Okay." And he got back into his car, but instead of driving away, he just sat there staring at me. I thought it was a little bit strange at the time, but I was focused on getting warmed up, so I didn't initially worry about it too much. I was only planning on staying out until about midnight anyway, so I wanted to maximize my time. It was the end of the dinner time, beginning of the bar time rush, so it took me a little while to realize that the beige SUV was still there, and the guy was still sitting in the driver's seat, staring at me. I'm pretty sure he didn't even pay the parking meter in the end. Anyway, at about 9:30, he hops out again. "Hey, are you hungry yet?" "No, I'm okay. I ate before I came out here." "Come on, I want to give you something, but I don't have any cash. Let me buy you dinner." This does happen. When someone who doesn't carry cash sees a street musician that they like, they will often offer to buy a snack and bring it to you, so I didn't find that too strange. "Okay, sure. If you want to bring me a snack, that's cool." "Okay, come with me." No, I mean, I'm not leaving my spot here. There's a really good restaurant I want to take you to, though, but it's too far to walk. We need to drive there." "Sorry, I'm not really interested in going somewhere. I need to stay here and make some money tonight." "I thought you were hungry, though. Come on, let me buy you dinner." Me, starting to get frustrated. "No, look, I told you I'm not actually that hungry. If you want to tip me with something other than cash, a slice of pizza from the place across the street, or a soda, or a cigarette or something, that I'm fine with, but I'm not leaving this spot, okay?" "No, I'm not going to buy you a slice of pizza. If you want dinner, you need to come with me." At this point, tons of people were walking past us, and I was getting really annoyed at him for keeping me from playing music. "Well, I'm not going anywhere, and I need to make some money tonight, so I'm done talking about this." At that point, I started playing my guitar to show him that I was done with this conversation. I probably should have been more concerned by this point, but I was honestly just a little bit ticked off. It wasn't that uncommon for men who saw me street performing to offer me food or shelter in exchange for sex, so I kind of assumed that that's what he was after at this point. And for about the next hour, I focused on just playing music and chatting with people, and it was actually a pretty productive night in the end. I had almost forgotten about the creepy dude until he got out of his car and leaned against the door, still staring at me. At this point, it's almost 11 p.m, and it dawned on me that he had been there for over 2 hours. That was certainly when the alarm bells finally started going off in my head. I had a hard time focusing on the music after that because he was just sort of standing there, staring at me, and the longer that it lasted, the more I felt like he had something more nefarious than just trying to bribe a young homeless woman to sleep with him in mind. At about 11:30, I realized that I needed to do something sooner rather than later. It was pretty much peak bar hour, but the streets were going to become less crowded eventually, and I was going to need to walk home at some point. I certainly didn't want to risk him following me. Now, when I'm street performing, I'm in friendly mode, and I'm not the most intimidating looking girl in general, so I don't think that he was expecting me to confront him directly, but when I feel threatened, I tend to get pretty mad pretty quickly. Figuring that I had plenty of witnesses, I walked right up to the guy, angry as heck by this point. "Look, why are you staring at me?" Taken aback, he says, "What? You've been staring at me for 3 hours now. Do you just like making younger women uncomfortable?" I was mad, talking progressively faster and louder, and it was very clear that this wasn't going the way that he expected it to. No, I just want to buy you dinner." "So you're just waiting for me to get hungry enough to go get dinner with you, when I've already said no several times? That's not being helpful, it's being creepy. And look, I know that there aren't any restaurants still open at like 11:30 p.m. around here anyway." No, this one is. It's still open." "I don't care if it's still open because I don't want to go anywhere with you, and I told you that. So why are you still here waiting?" "No, you don't understand." He looked like he was racking his brain for an excuse at this point. What am I not understanding about you staring at me for the last 3 hours?" "No, you see, I'm an Uber driver." Of all the stupid excuses that he could have picked, this was possibly the dumbest. Me pretending to understand,
Oh, okay, I get it. You've been waiting all this time for someone who ordered an Uber. Yeah, that's it. Me dropping the act. And you were just going to leave them waiting while you took me to a restaurant then? What happened next freaked me out more than anything else that night, because as soon as I blew a hole through this guy's story, it was suddenly like he took off a mask. His smile disappeared, and his voice was deadly serious as he climbed back into his car and said to me, "Okay, you'll never see my face again." And he drove off, fast. I just stood there in shock. And look, I'd had plenty of creepy encounters while street performing, but not like this one. It was impossible to convince myself that he was going to do anything besides abduct me. I was done after that too. I decided to order an actual Uber home instead of walking, which cost about half of what I'd made in the tips that night. And in the back of that Uber, counting my cash, I realized then that it was time to retire. The small amount of money that I made during the daytime was not worth the effort, and the decent money that I made at night was definitely not worth the risk anymore. I've since moved on to a new side hustle and also developed agoraphobia, diagnosed by the way, because of this and other incidents like it. I hate leaving the house alone, and I order most of my groceries and household supplies through DoorDash now, and I have a job that's only 3 blocks away from my apartment. Still though, on my walks to and from work, I find myself constantly checking my surroundings, using the reflection in the storefront windows to make sure that I'm not being followed. Honestly too, I really hope that this creepy guy in the SUV keeps his promise and that I never see his face again. I grew up in an old house in the UK. My family home is a 4-story terrace, just over 250 years old, situated on a busy street. It was originally a manor house with lots of land, but was split into 3 terraced homes with more built sort of alongside of it in the late 1890s to early 1900s. There were 2 cellars, basement rooms, 2 living rooms on the ground floor, and the kitchen. The first floor had the bathroom, my parents' bedroom, and my brother's bedroom, and the second floor was my bedroom or living space. Now, I have experiences there from being very young that I may share in the future, but for now I'll focus on some experiences that happened in my family home from me being around 15 to 16 to my early 20s. When I was around 15 to 16, I was up in my bedroom reading. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I lived with my parents, obviously, my younger brother, 2 years younger, and our dog. I had no music on or TV this day, but I could hear general muted traffic noise outside. At some point, I heard someone come in downstairs, the door opening, closing, and keys rattling. My mum shouted hello up to me and told me to come downstairs because they, Mum and Dad, needed to talk to me about something. This was weird, as usually she'd just tell me whatever it was that I needed to know if she was shouting up to me anyway. I asked why, and she shouted back, "Just come downstairs," in a sort of frustrated tone too. So I did, thinking that it must have been important or I must have done something wrong or something. I got downstairs and quickly became confused though because I couldn't find them anywhere. I shouted hello in case they'd gone into the cellar. This wouldn't be normal either, but nobody responded and I was confused trying to work out where they might have gone. I thought that I must have been imagining it though and started to walk back upstairs when my brother shouted down from his room asking me what Mum wanted because it was weird that she called me down. I replied to him saying, "Did you hear her too?" Obviously I assumed that he must have, but I was just a bit weirded out because this meant that he'd heard her too, but I was sure that there was nobody there and I was second guessing myself, I guess. But then he didn't respond. So I walked up to his room to talk to him about it. I opened his door and he wasn't there either. It was then that I got this weird chill sensation and goosebumps and started to feel a bit spooked, so I left his room and went back downstairs trying to make sense of what had just happened. Weirdly too, just as I got back downstairs, my mum suddenly walked in with the dog. She'd taken him on a walk and I asked her what happened and where she had gone. She was confused and assured me that she had been out for around an hour at this point and had not been back at any stage. She said that my dad was at work, he had been out since 8 a.m. and was due back in a few hours' time, and my brother, well, he was allegedly at his friend's house. On another occasion when I was 20, I was working in an off-license sort of convenience store. The store closed at 10 p.m, and once we closed, cashed up, cleaned up, etc., I'd get out at about 10:30, home for around 11, still living at home at this stage. My mum called me at 10:10 p.m. asking me where I had gone, and obviously I was confused and told her that I was still at work locking up, and she said that I had come home 15 minutes ago. Her and my dad were in the front living room and they heard me come in. A little bit of context here too is that we used the back door to come in and out and had 2 living rooms, one at the back and one at the front. My mum and dad would be in the front room, which was closed off, from the other, and the stairs were in between them. Mum said though that they had heard me come in, shout hello, which we normally did when any of us came home. Mum and dad both said hello back and asked me why I was home so early. They said that I shouted, "So you're ignoring me then?" in a sort of jokey way, and they heard me walk upstairs chatting on the phone with someone. My dad then came upstairs, first floor, and shouted up to me to see why I was home so early and to check that everything was okay when he noticed my light wasn't on and it was silent. So he came back down and they called me and found out that I hadn't been there at all. My dad rushed upstairs to make sure that nobody had broken in or anything, but there was nobody around. On another occasion when I was around 20, my mum and dad were sitting in the living room quite late, 2 a.m.-ish I think, and heard my brother practicing his guitar in his room. This wasn't unusual as he would often practice for hours. They were enjoying listening to him play faintly when they both remembered at the same time that he was in university, living in student accommodation 200 miles away, and he had taken his guitars with him. When I was around 22 years old, my best friend was visiting at one stage. It was a Friday night. I had been quite unwell, so she was coming around to chill, listen to music, chat, etc. My parents were out at a function this night, and it was mid-January-ish. My friend went upstairs to use the bathroom, next to my brother's bedroom, and when she came downstairs, she said, "Oh, your brother has just shouted you for something. He must have thought that I was you when I came upstairs." My brother, though, was back at uni, and we were alone in that house. I asked her if she was certain that she heard him, and she was adamant that she had, to the point that she really thought that I was trying to spook her for a laugh. She knew of the above occurrences and they freaked her out. I told her, though, that he wasn't there and that he was at uni. She didn't believe me, in fact, and demanded that we go upstairs to see what he wanted. She was 100% convinced that she had just heard him, so I shouted, and obviously I got no response. She said, "He mustn't have heard you," so I invited her up with me to prove that he wasn't home. She confidently came with me, still certain that I was joking around. We got to his room, I opened the door, the light was off, and his things weren't there, and obviously neither was he. She turned a bit of a funny grey colour after that, and she wasn't okay. If you're familiar with the Denver area, I lived in the Clayton neighborhood on York. As with all millennials, the rental market crippled me and I had to find a place with charm, aka a 1920s brick duplex with 1970s updates, in the year of our Lord 2022. But as a recently divorced man with 50-50 custody, my bank account dictated my residence. To give you a sense of the space, it was a shotgun-adjacent style home, 900 square feet, upstairs, with an unfinished basement that was really only used for laundry and housing spiders. My daughter and I had rooms on either end of the 10-foot narrow hallway, with the world's smallest full bathroom splitting the distance. For the first few months, it was just an old house on a busy street, Fire trucks, ambulances, and cop cars flew down the street each night. So much so that I had to get blackout curtains or my room would legitimately look like a knockoff disco of flashing lights. My daughter was 5 at the time and she had a hard time adjusting to living in 2 houses. She would frequently climb into bed halfway through the night because something had woken her up and she was scared. I would feel her crawl in and over me routinely, hands, elbows, and knees, feet even, all haphazardly crawling all over me. Now, one night, around 2 in the morning, I felt her, but this time not crawling into the bed, but crawling out. I felt her tug my shirt, pulling me to the side to crawl out of the door, and I don't know why the change in direction woke me up, but it gave me an uneasy feeling, so I rolled over to grab her so she wouldn't fall off the bed. I murmured something like, "Kiddo, do you need to go to the bathroom?" But as I turned to grab her, I felt nothing. My arms folded into each other and my eyes shot open instantly, thinking that she tumbled off the bed. As I sat up groggily, I saw her standing in the doorway, but that was when I realized that it wasn't her. I can still remember the face, close to my daughter's age, a slight smirk, innocent and playful. She wore a yellow sundress with white flowers. She's burned into my memory, but not in a frightening way, I suppose. I turned to look at my daughter, passed out cold, snoring on the other side. When I quickly snapped my head back to where the little girl was standing, whoever she was gone. I've told that story a million times, and it wasn't the last experience that I had there, and the little girl certainly wasn't the only person that I saw. Now, for some time, it was unsettling thinking about the little girl. I hated scary movies. The jump scenes always made me flinch, but seeing her that night was different. There was no smash cut to a twisted face, no loud sound, just a little girl standing there looking at me with a soft smile. If anything, it felt like a roommate messing with me, maybe. I felt her, I felt my shirt being tugged. I felt the weight on my chest, which means that it wasn't a dream. It was a physical experience. Honestly, I felt like I was losing my mind for some time after that. I hadn't told anyone yet. There wasn't a way that I could share it and not make it sound like I was just dreaming. And honestly, I had started to convince myself that it probably was just a dream. Unfortunately, or I don't know, perhaps fortunately, the next day would make it much harder to convince myself that I was dreaming. So if you know anything about rec hockey, then you know it's hard to find open sheets of ice. My beer league games mostly started at 9 or later. I had leaned into playing, and as a single dad, needed help with my daughter on the late weeknights. My mum offered to come over and watch her while I played, which was a nice break from the week and a good way to distract me from the night before as well. When I got home at around 11, my mum was in the living room reading a book. She walked over to me and almost hugged me until this stink of the hockey gear caught up to her. I still remember her looking at me and saying, "So it was kind of a weird night." I put my keys on the table and asked her what she meant, and she said, "Well, your electric razor turned on in the bathroom a few times." I chalked it up to just a weird coincidence, but then she said, "And I kept getting up to check on Lou. It was weird because I thought I was hearing her run up and down the hallway. And I could have sworn that I heard her giggle, but every time that I got up to check on her, the door was closed and she was asleep." It was real. She experienced it. I didn't tell her about that night too. Honestly, I didn't want to admit it to myself because it meant the night before, the little girl, that it was all real. And that she wanted to play or something. Anyway, I've since moved in with my girlfriend in a house that feels quiet and calm. Sitting outside now, it's a lot easier to process through everything, but after the experiences I had with seeing the girl and my mum telling me that she had heard the little girl running up and down the hallway, laughing and trying to get her attention, the house felt open to more activity at the time. The summer in Denver is warmer than most people think, and this house had no air conditioning. Even with fans, it was easy to climb up to 80 inside with even the best fan setup. This was honestly my first step for my debunking too, because I thought that I was having some type of I don't know, like fever or heat-induced experience. I bought several swamp cooler style fans, and while I felt comfortable temp-wise, it definitely didn't help. My next thought was carbon monoxide or black mold or something. I became obsessed with trying to find out why I was hearing, seeing, and feeling things, but in the end, I couldn't find an answer and nothing helped. That summer too was a cluster of experiences. I can't recall each one in order because it was easily weekly, sometimes almost a daily feeling in fact. The main feeling though was what I could only describe as, I don't know, like static energy. I tried to explain it to people like standing next to one of those electrical towers. It wasn't audible, but I could feel it walking in the hallway, in my bedroom, and the kitchen steps down to the basement. Like, for instance, the basement steps, they were old and creaky, and initially I would think that it was the house settling, and to a degree it probably was the case. However, there were two very specific instances that it was not the case. One night I was brushing my teeth and I heard my cat's ping pong ball bouncing in the kitchen and down the steps. This happened 3 times. A steady bounce, bounce, bounce on the tile floors, and then a hit off the wall leading down the steps, bouncing down one stair and hitting the door to the backyard. After the 3rd time, I called out to my cat to knock it off, and I remember so vividly sticking my head out of the door and looking into the kitchen, and there was my cat, not in the kitchen but laying in my daughter's room, in a very cat-like pose of not caring. But there was just no way that she could have made it over there and lounged in the time that I had heard the last ball bounce down. On another occasion, I was working from home and had my computer set up in my dining room. Again, in shotgun fashion, the house basically was a straight line from the back door to the front door. My desk was set up in a way that I could look out the front window of the living room to my back room. I was on a team call with an employee, and that's when I heard footsteps running up and down the back stairs, to the point where I had to tell my employee to give me a second. I leaned back and told the cat to knock it off and looked back at the screen when my face went white, and I did a double take down the stairs, because when I had looked back at the screen, I had noticed my cat, again in a very casual pose, sitting on the couch in the main room. I had told my employees about it, and when this particular one experienced it with me, I felt very validated by this because the steps were clear enough that they were audible but quick and playful, and they had heard it too. And if it wasn't a cat, then it was something small and curious, and I really don't know how to explain it. Now, this next one is hard to describe, but I'll try. So, as more things happened, I started talking about it more, generally on the phone or on team calls. If I was in a room, the hallway or kitchen and started to talk about the little girl, I could suddenly feel her around me. What this felt like was a sort of quieting of surrounding noises. If you can think about the sensation when you faint, the noise kind of muting or to a quiet ringing, almost like a tunnel hearing instead of a tunnel vision, that was a trigger for me. The next sensation would be a classic goosebumps, and then kind of like an inner radar where I'd just see a part of the room in my head. A lot of the times it was the hallway, but I'd just have this feeling of like, hey, look here. All 3 of those would intensify, and I would have to intentionally say no and walk away to sort of break it off. Honestly, I don't think that I'm doing it justice to just how constant the feelings and the little sounds were in this place. I only slept with headphones there. Nothing ever felt evil, I guess, but I just couldn't keep up with the constant movement and energy. I needed to sleep, and things were too curious with me, and it got to the point where I'd pretty regularly feel a little tug here or a pressure there on my bed. I stopped letting my cat stay in my room to try and debunk that, and it persisted. I told my mum about all of this, and she, for my birthday, told me about her friend, who apparently was a medium. Even with all of my personal experiences, I had serious doubts about this all, and I made sure not to give him any info prior to and told my mum to do the same. When I showed up to his house though, we sat down and I did a tarot reading, first time I'd ever done it, a little cleanse and then dowsing rods too. This was when my inner skeptic certainly kicked in. I mean, here I was holding 2 rods apparently communing with the dead. Nothing happened. I held them in my hands and asked a few questions, and they limply moved, but nothing of consequence. I remember him asking me to ask a general question about anything, so I paused and asked if I should leave my house. The rods didn't move, but he looked at me and said, "I want to talk about your house. There's a girl there, isn't there?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, my daughter," and he smirked. "No, you've seen a little girl. She's like a bedroom, a hallway, stairs or something. Very playful." At that, I remember putting the dowsing rods down and just asked, "What does she look like to you?" At this point, I was trying to see if it was a tell I was giving off or something to make all of this make sense. "She's not from now. I see her in like a homemade type of sundress. She's probably close in age to your daughter. Flowers. I see flowers." I was lost in the vision of the girl that he was describing to perfection. "She likes to play at night a lot, doesn't she? You have balls that she throws for you, or a pet or something. She's not evil, she just likes having nice people there. And she isn't the only one there, too." Honestly, whether I had fully understood it or not, I was at terms with the little girl that I had seen, but there was something else in the house, something older and bigger. At times, the movement that I heard and the energy that I had felt was different, heavier and not as playful. I really did not like hearing him say that. He told me that the girl was someone to talk to, basically to talk to her like a parent if I was over her playing and needed a quiet space. But as I told him what I experienced with feeling the tunnel hearing, the inner vision of where people were, he told me to be careful. It sounded like I was sensitive and that thinking was one thing, but talking directly to something, allowing them in, could lead to attachment. I can assure you that that day was a long drive back home. 2 nights later, I was laying in my bed, and I heard books on my shelf being flipped through. At first, I sort of chalked it up to the fan, but after about 5 minutes of the noise, I turned the fan off and it kept going, like somebody flicking through books. I sat up quickly, 2 or 3 times flashing my phone's flashlight to try and catch something, but there was nothing. After one more attempt, I turned off the flashlight and I sat in my bed and said, "I need to go to bed now and I need you to be quiet in here. Please, go to bed." All the sensations suddenly hit me. The quiet noise, the goosebumps, seeing where she was, and then it was quiet. It stayed quiet. After that, I said thank you, and then I fell asleep. This took place about 10 years ago. So, there I was in my beat-up Jeep Wrangler, rolling home from my girlfriend's house at about 2 a.m. It's pitch dark on this twisty back road with forest on my left and a Christmas tree farm on my right. The road is pretty narrow and has very little shoulder, but not much bank either, just gravel and grass really. I'm going way faster than I should be when I come around the next bend and there's a grey Camaro with black racing stripes. Looks like maybe an SS from the 70s, but it's hard to say. Parked completely sideways, blocking nearly the full width of the road, headlights shining into the tree farm. And there's this guy, leather jacket and jeans, slicked back salt and pepper hair, leaned back casually on the side of the car smoking a cigarette. I slammed my brakes and managed to bring it to a slow roll. I'm too trusting of a person, so I think, oh wow, must be having some car trouble. I'll roll my window down and pull up to see if he needs help. Before I can even start rolling my window down, this dude tosses his cigarette to the ground and full-on starts walking at me. Not along the side of the road or toward my driving side conversationally, but straight into my headlights, straight at my still-moving Wrangler in fact, and he looks furious. So at this point, I'm like, alright, forget this. He's either angry for how fast I was going, or a plainclothes cop, or something like that. So I gun it, and yank the wheel over, jumping off into the grass on the side of the road, whip around the tail of his car, and I distinctly recall, for some reason, the taillights feeling extremely bright as I passed. This angry red just sort of filling my vision, and lighting the whole cabin of my Wrangler up. Eventually I pull back up on the road and check my rear view, afraid that I'd hit him, or afraid that he might be after me now, or just plain afraid, who knows, but when I do, there's nothing. No car, no man, no illumination on the tree farm, nothing. Now I do stop. I pull over and I get out, thinking that I must have gone further than I thought and around another curve or something. But no, this is definitely the curve. I've only made it about another 50 feet, if that. In fact, I can see my torn up tracks in the grass from where I went, both where I got back on the road and where I went off initially. To this day, I wish I had the sense to go back and check for that cigarette butt or anything, any sign of him. But I was way too creeped out at that point. So in the end, I got back in my Jeep and I got out of there. So I work at a bar that has a back alley that then leads into a small secluded parking lot. There are several large trash cans, and many small ones there too, and there are some addicts, homeless folks, etc., who will come to the alley pretty often. Usually they're pretty harmless and just look through the trash or ask for $1, but sometimes they aren't, and tonight was one of those times. So I went out to the back to throw out a bag of trash when I noticed a man walking quickly by the farthest group of garbage cans from the back door, which also happens to be the one that I use. He looked in my direction. I don't think that he knew that I could see him, and then as he saw me walking toward him and the trash can, he quickly and quietly hid himself in the dark behind the trash cans. I didn't see where he ended up, but it scared me a lot. I mean, I was the only one around, and I knew that he was hiding there because I would have seen him walk past if not, and it was the only way to go, so really, he was hiding there waiting for me to do, well, I don't want to think about that. I left my bag of trash right there where it was, and I immediately walked back inside. I hope that he left soon after I went back in because I would hate to see somebody get hurt. August 11, 2001. It's easy to remember the exact date because it was the same night as the premiere of Samurai Jack on Cartoon Network. I was 8 years old at the time, and this was a big deal. So of course I had a sleepover with my best friend Kay at her mum's house. We slept in the living room so that we could watch TV as we fell asleep. I was showing Kay my new favorite movie, Titan AE, and around 3 a.m., we were woken up by decorative indoor wind chimes. For whatever reason, they were going crazy, like there were actual wind gusts in the house. At the same time, it sounded like a whole pack of cats fighting in the front yard. Being children, it freaked us out, and we decided to go tell her mum that we were going to move to the bedroom for the rest of the night. When we opened the door to the room that her mum and 12-year-old sister had been sleeping in, we couldn't see them in the bed. Kay climbed into the bed and was like, "What the heck? There's no one here." So we assumed that they had moved to one of the other bedrooms, but there were 3 after all. So we began the search, but they weren't in any of the rooms. We started turning on every light in the house and getting a bit frantic. Doors were locked, keys were on the rack, car was in the driveway. Kay was freaking out because she thought that her mum's stalker got out of prison and abducted her mum and sister. Now, the next thing that I remember was the sunlight was what woke me up in the next morning. We were back on the living room floor as if we had never gotten up, with no memory of going back to sleep. But the weirdest thing is that we both recalled vividly looking for her mum and sister. So, naturally, we interrogated them the second that we saw them. Luckily, my bestie's mum is pretty open-minded and she actually believed that we weren't making it up, and that was pretty strange as well. Her mother, to this day, continues to recall the details of that day, but unfortunately my friend has somehow completely forgotten that it happened. I usually get a bit of a dismissive reaction when I share this story. My husband believes that it was a dream or sleep paralysis, which I have no problem considering, but I mean, come on, it's not that. I do wonder how Kay would forget something that we used to talk about obsessively as we got older. Others have suggested that I ask her mum and sister if they still remember our story. I will soon, but they're dealing with something at the moment, and it would be a bit inappropriate to bother them with this at this stage. But like I said, the last time that I talked to her, she recalled it, and she remembers that night in detail.